So before I'm going to hand over to today's speakers, Steve and Paul, and while people are still tuning in, I just wanted to say hello and introduce exactly what Customer Centricity Month is. So I'm Lauren and I head up the events and marketing team at CXPartners. So at CXPartners, we work with organisations to drive growth, to unlock opportunities and enable teams to work together more effectively. And we do this through our research programs, through user-centered design, and by embedding a culture of customer centricity within organisations. So earlier this year, we launched our customer centricity model, which was the culmination of a study and a detailed research piece with over 100 European brands into what builds a highly resilient and successful organisation. And that study found that customer centricity was the answer. So then Customer Centricity Month was designed so that we could dive into the details of our model and the 5 dimensions which build a customer-centric organisation. As I mentioned, this is the first webinar of the month, and we'll be running 3 further sessions, all on Wednesdays throughout November. So if you haven't already, do make sure that the rest of them are in your diary, and we'll put a link in the chat just now so that you can let us know if they're not, and we can send them over to you. So I can see you all flocking in, which is really, really good to see. I'm going to hand over to today's speakers, Steve and Paul. So Steve's going to lead to today's session, and then we've got our brilliant guest speaker, Paul Burrows from British Council. So there will be time at the end for questions, but if you add them to the Q&A or the chat throughout the webinar, and then when we get to the end, we'll run through as many as possible. So Steve, I'm going to hand over to you now.
Brilliant, thanks Lauren. Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining. I'm Steve Cable. I'm an experienced design director at CXPartners. I've been doing user-centered design for over 15 years now, and I kind of helped develop the customer centricity model with Google that we released earlier this year. And so the focus of today's talks are going to be around process, but specifically around discovery and how discovery fits in and benefits that process. So I'm going to talk a bit about kind of why it's important, and I guess how you can kind of convince people that it's important. And then Paul, who's going to be popping up later, will talk a bit about how you can maybe turn discovery into action, as sometimes that can be a bit tricky. So I guess probably the question first to answer is, okay, well, why are we talking about process? And why are we talking about discovery specifically in process? Because there's lots of bits of process that is important. And I guess to do that, it's probably worth talking a bit about the customer centricity model that Lauren mentioned. And so kind of Google approached us to help them develop a way to gauge how customer-centered organizations are. And to do that, we kind of created a whole bunch of questions that kind of dig into how people do things, why they do things, how decisions get made, who they hire, and all this kind of stuff. And these questions seem to fit into these kind of 5 dimensions that we kind of saw made up how customer-centered an organization was. And the dimensions are what you can see here. So down at the bottom there, we've got communication, which is just about how you communicate strategy, how aware everybody is of what everybody else is doing within the organization, how you share insights. People is about who you've got in the organization, not just the roles you have, but how you use those roles and the culture that you have. Facilities is about the tools, technology, and even the physical spaces that you have that enable those people to work. Governance is all about your decisions, the strategy, and the day-to-day running of your business. And then finally, process, which is what we're going to focus on this week, which is really about the techniques and the practices and the steps you take to deliver change. And it's kind of really kind of the railroad that everything else follows to kind of lead to success. Processes today, but then I guess why discovery? So I guess to get to why discovery, we need to dig in a bit into one of the other reasons that we did the customer centricity model, because we wanted to do the model to see how customer-centered organizations really were, because a lot of organizations say they're customer-centered, but is that really the case, I suppose? But also, we didn't want to talk about customer centricity for the sake of customer centricity. We wanted to see if there was a correlation between those that scored highly on this model and positive business outcomes as well. So we looked at all the people that took part in the survey, and we looked at kind of other sources of data. We looked at things like their revenue, and we found that actually the highly customer-centered organizations were around year on year had growth that was kind of 9 times more than those that were low maturity. So they were kind of growing more, which was really great to see. We also got them to kind of report on things like speed of delivery and kind of how able they were to deliver change. And we found that the more customer-centered organizations were able to deliver change to products and services in a matter of weeks instead of a matter of years, as it was for some kind of low mature organizations. So they were able to kind of get stuff out, but they were able to make decisions a lot quicker as well. And they also reported that organizations that were kind of highly customer-centered had higher levels of employee satisfaction as well. And I think I'll dig into why these things might be a little bit later, because as well as kind of finding out how customer-centered they were and whether there was a benefit, and it was great to see that there was a benefit, we also wanted to see, okay, well, what is the things that organizations are doing differently? So where are the biggest gaps between high maturity organizations and low maturity organizations? And I think within process, one of the biggest gaps we saw was within how they utilized user research. So for example, some of the questions we asked that are investigated in the model are around how they make decisions, around strategy. And we found that most organizations, regardless of their maturity or their performance level, they made use of some level of quantitative data, would be that market trend report analysis or whether that's analytics. One of the key differentiators between high performers and everyone else was the use of qualitative research, so taking the time to stop and talk to customers and find out what their needs and goals were. And we found that high performers were almost twice as likely to do that as all the others as well. And that was also the case for more kind of strategic decisions. So when thinking about what are we going to put in our backlogs, what are we going to build next, it was quite common for people to really prioritize management concerns and stakeholder priorities, but it was more likely in the lower end of the kind of performance companies. But then when we thought about, okay, well, who includes research in their product backlogs, we found that the people that were kind of, performing really well were 8 times more likely to do research to inform their product backlogs. So there's quite a vast difference there. And I think what that tells me is, okay, well, we know that there's a link between performance and customer centricity. And then within the world of process, there's a kind of gap between those that do and don't value having a really good, deep understanding of user insights as they do them. So there's definitely a value to doing discovery. So I guess the question is, why do we still see a lot of organizations not do it? And I think the most common thing we see when we work with organizations, and certainly maybe less mature organizations, is that they just simply feel like they don't need it. And you can kind of see why, right? If you're working in a big organization full of lots of clever people and they've had many, many years of experience within that industry, they're going to know a lot about that industry, and therefore they're going to make assumptions that they know a lot about what their customers need. And when you look at discovery as a bit of a process, I guess it can be sometimes easy to fall into the assumption that discovery can slow things down, right? There's money that you could be using to build something and get in front of customers that you're taking away to put into discovery, and you are taking time away, right? You're having to effectively pause building things for maybe a couple of months to understand the problem. And so it can seem kind of slow and it can seem expensive, but I guess it only seems slow and expensive if you think that you don't need it. And I guess the other issue with discovery compared to, say, just getting on and delivering things is it can be kind of hard to measure the explicit value that discovery brings, right? So let's say you were going to have a bit of budget and you were going to put that into just optimizing a checkout. You can make a little tweak to that checkout and you can see conversion rates go up as a result of that work. Whereas you do a bit of discovery, there's not really any needle moving as a result of that. So it can be hard to see kind of the value that it brings. But I guess with discovery, it's less about kind of seeing an initial immediate value, and it's not really about thinking about what is the value it brings, but maybe it's more helpful to think about what is the cost of not doing it? What are you missing out on if you don't do it? And I suppose a useful way to illustrate that is to kind of tell a bit of a story about a supermarket that we worked with quite a few years ago. So it's a supermarket from Switzerland, and they came to us saying that they needed to redesign their online supermarket in order to kind of keep up in a quite competitive market, really. And there's kind of a big problem with online supermarkets in that they're really kind of expensive to run. There's a lot of infrastructure that it takes to kind of pick out the items and get them to people's homes. And so they really need each of their kind of orders to be around £100 or more in order to kind of break even. And so there's a need for their customers to pick out, every time they come to that site, to pick out 50 items out of a catalogue of around 30,000 items and make sure that they pick out all the right ones from that massive catalogue and make sure that they don't miss anything. Because if you do an online shop and you forget something, you have to end up going to the physical shop to pick that up anyway, and it makes the whole process redundant, and then people are less engaged with that product. So they came to us with a brief that had a big old list of problems that they felt needed to be solved. Here's all the things that we need to solve for our customers in order to stay competitive. You know, we need to help people remember what it is they need to buy. We need to help people remember all the different lists that they have and manage multiple lists of things that they have. We need to help people remember all the favorite things they have and get to those favorite things. We need to help people figure out what they're going to cook for dinner tonight. We need to give them the recipes of how to cook things. All of these bunch of problems that they wanted to be solved with a bunch of features that they felt this was how they were going to solve it. And it was quite a big, scary list. And kind of we investigated a little bit and asked, okay, well, where have these problems come from? Are these problems you've seen with your customers? And it turned out they hadn't come from the customers. They'd come from looking at what their competitors were doing. And we quickly realized that the online grocery store back then was in this real arms race of who can build the next feature to try and attract more customers. And we didn't stop and ask, you know, so they kind of looked at what their competitors were doing, but they didn't stop and ask, okay, well, what did the customers really need? You know, there was a lot of clever people in the room. As I mentioned before, you know, there was a lot of clever people with a lot of years of experience. And so they felt they had a really good understanding of their customers, despite not having talked to any in maybe ever. And so we were left with this big, scary list of problems that needed to be solved. And it was a big, scary list, because when you looked at this big list of things that they felt they needed to do, there was just no way to do it within the budget that they had, within the time that they needed it by, and certainly not within a quality that we would be happy with, they would be happy with, or their customers would be happy with. Just nobody could have delivered that. So we had to figure out, okay, well, where should we be focusing? And so we convinced them essentially what we need to do is take some of that money that you want to solve those problems and actually use it to understand the problems a bit better. And it did take some convincing for them, because they'd never really worked in a user-centered way before, or used any kind of UX methodology before, but we managed it, and we were able to go and watch people shop online, but also in store. to learn about what their problems really were. So what are the goals? What are the things they're trying to achieve when they go and do their weekly shop? And what are the behaviors they exhibit as they go through, and what are the problems that they face along the way? And we found that big list of problems wasn't really the right things to be focusing on fairly quickly. The problem of remembering what I need to buy in a shop, although it was there, it wasn't the most important one. We even as part of our research, we even actually started picking up shopping lists that had been discarded in the car park. And they were very rarely huge, exhaustive lists. It was things like dinner, something nice for Jane, vegetables, fruit, and I'll pack lunch bits. So it wasn't even these exhaustive kind of lists of every single item they needed. They were just kind of prompts. And instead, what we found were kind of two different, very core problems that needed to be solved. So the first one was this problem of just finding things, right? So as I mentioned before, people are trying to find 50 items out of a catalogue of 30,000. So trying to find stuff in a supermarket is really difficult, especially if it's a supermarket you've never been in before. And so if you're going to an online supermarket, certainly for the first time, it's really hard to find things. I think a really good illustration of this is if you kind of picture what the pasta aisle looks like in a supermarket. Now with pasta, there's all these different facets of what pasta could be. You've got different prices from budget to luxury. You've got different brands of pasta. You've got different types of pasta. You've got different sized packages, and you've got multiples of all of those things combined together. And the way at the time that online supermarkets were organizing their pastas, was certainly for this store, was by price and by popularity. And nobody was really shopping for spaghetti based on what was the third most popular spaghetti at the time. Whereas if you went into the store, everything was arranged in a much more logical way. Things were placed in relation to their similarities to other things. And so what we learned quickly was a lot of time and energy needed to go into findability, and not even with the design of it, but actually with the metadata that sat underneath all of these products. What's the right metadata that we need to have that will enable people to find the things they want, even when they don't actually know specifically the exact name of the thing they're looking for, right? Not everybody knows the right name of the product that they're looking for. They have their own name for it as well. So that was problem number one. And then problem number two was kind of really led by the client. They wanted to make sure people increased their basket value and wanted to buy more stuff. And their solution to that was kind of recipe inspirators, these media rich, interactive things that would tell you what to cook and show you how to make them and things like that. And there was an in-store version of that, right, which is those printed recipe cards or those magazines. And what we found in the store when we watched people shop was those stacks of recipe cards at the front of the store tended to stay at the front of the store and nobody really picked them up. And actually where the inspiration came from was how the products were placed in the store. So, somebody would be going up and shopping for steak, and maybe the store manager had left, put some red wine at the end of the aisle as well. And they think, okay, beef bourguignon, that's something I haven't made in a while. So I'm going to need some bouquet garni and some mash and some, some asparagus or whatever they wanted to finish that off. So it became less about how do we teach people how to cook and more about how do we merchandise in a way that will inspire people. And so that's what we did. We went from a list of kind of 10, 15 problems down to two core problems, which was findability and merchandising. And we spent loads of that budget and effort on building a really solid kind of metadata underneath all the products, and a solid way to kind of allow co-op to merchandise at the right points in the journey. And by focusing on building those right things, we were able to get some really great results. They've got great increase in sales year on year, and a 1% increase in market share, which doesn't sound like a big number, but in the world of groceries, that's worth a lot of money. And what was interesting as well was we never said to them, okay, never focus on these other 10 to 15 problems, but focus on these first, make a bit of money and reinvest, and then you can start to fix those problems. And what was interesting was after we did this, they didn't start to fix those problems straight away, because as part of that discovery, they noticed a new problem, which was the way people buy meat is quite different from the way they buy all other products, right? Buying a box of cereal or a 6-pack of beer is very different from kind of choosing a fresh cut of meat, that every single one of those bits of meat that you're looking at in the store are going to be slightly different, and you're trying to find the exact one. And so they'd identified kind of a new kind of need, and now they were brought into this whole discovery process. They were able to investigate that even further and kind of redefine the way meat was bought in grocery stores online back at the time. I guess it's probably worth saying that, you know, back when we did this, I think it was like 2014, 2015, not many supermarkets looked like this. I mean, what you're probably seeing here is like fairly standard, but not many supermarkets looked like it back then, and now they kind of do. So I guess it just makes me think, you know, this project always makes me reflect back and go, imagine if we hadn't done that discovery. Imagine if we just solved all the same problems that the competitors were solving. We would have built, you know, a load of features not particularly well and not really solved the right things for customers. And instead we focused on one or two key problems that we were able to put a lot of time and a lot of energy into solving. So we managed to deliver on time, in budget, and get really good results instead of going over time with poor results. And so if we kind of loop that all the way back to kind of those key benefits that we saw, or those kind of key performance indicators that we saw, is that high mature and highly customer-centered organizations were seeing, you can kind of start to see why, I suppose. So, you know, by doing discovery and understanding what the right problems are to solve for people, of course, you're going to kind of be able to get more customers if you're solving the right things. And also you're saving money by not wasting time and money building the wrong things or the things that don't work. When it comes to being fast at changing, you can see how discovery will help you do that. And it certainly did for Co-op, because it enabled us to make decisions faster. It's really interesting by taking the time. You know, initially you would assume, oh, it's going to slow us down, implementing this change, because we're going to wait a couple of months to find some stuff out. But actually, it allowed us to accelerate much faster after that discovery was done, because everybody understood why we were doing the things that we were doing, and they were able to make much more faster decisions because everybody had been brought along to understand what the customer's needs were. And it enabled us to kind of convince higher level stakeholders much easier, because we had evidence to suggest why we were doing the things that we were doing. And then for kind of high employee engagement, I think it comes down to the fact that, you know, if you're doing discovery and it's really clear why you are solving the problems that you are solving, everybody is going to have a much better understanding of why they're doing what they're doing and be much more satisfied in doing it. And I think the other interesting thing with discovery and employee satisfaction is, you know, quite often when we work with organizations, certainly ones that aren't really mature in kind of doing research, one of the first steps we do is talk to the customer facing staff, because it's a really rich source of information about kind of customer needs. And what you will typically find is a lot of frustration, because they are quite aware of what the customer's problems are, and they're hearing them again and again, and nothing's getting fixed about them. And so there's a lot of frustration there. So if you're doing discovery and finding out the right problems and fixing the right problems, your people on the ground are going to be much more satisfied, because they're not having to deal with fixing those problems over and over and over again. So yeah, I mean, Paul, how does that kind of resonate with you?
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, there's an awful lot there that sounds familiar. I guess most immediately that comes to mind, my local supermarket's in the process of reorganising all of its shelves, and it's an absolute findability nightmare. So I totally get that. I plan to share some of my experiences with you on discovery, and a lot of the points you've just been making I think come together. So by way of a quick introduction, I'm Paul Burrows. I'm the Commercial Director of Transformation at the British Council. Prior to that, I was working in financial services as Customer Experience and Operations Director for AXA Insurance, and I spent a long period working in travel, ahead of that in e-commerce and customer experience roles, working with TUI. So for a bit of context, for those that don't know the British Council, The British Council is a UK charity and public body. It's got a turnover of almost £1 billion, employing around 10,000 colleagues across the world. And it's got a mission to support peace and prosperity by building connections, understanding and trust between people in the UK and countries worldwide. It's quite a far-reaching mission. We work with people in over 200 countries and territories, and we're on the ground in more than 100 countries. A lot of our commercial activities focused on English language teaching globally, and also providing English language tests to support migration for study and work, and they're pretty high stakes tests for people. The pandemic impacted face-to-face teaching and our ability to run exams, but also had a big impact on the demand for international migration for study and work. So yeah, the business was hit hard, and like a lot of businesses, there was a rapid move to digital services with online and virtual class learning. I joined the British Council recently with the remit to improve capability within sales and customer management and to support the business recovery and growth. So that's a bit of context. I'm going to share some examples that we've been going through, both with the British Council, but also previously that I've had. So making the case for discovery, Steve's just been talking about this. When I came in, there was a proposal for change, which had already been put forward, hadn't yet been approved and moved forward. And it highlighted customer issues and made plans to change ways of working, I guess, to address them. And whilst the proposal made sense, it was siloed. It was proposing solutions for customer-facing interactions within the customer service teams. It was absolutely in the remit of the people that were putting the proposal forward. It also pointed out some failure points across the journey, but didn't have a particular plan to address them itself. At the same time as I was going through my induction process, I met people across the organisation and heard about the many projects and initiatives that were underway and planned. Again, individually, they're all sound and they spoke about customer needs and usually had some good research that backed up that need. In fact, I think research and working from evidence is a real strength of the British Council. But like many organisations, I didn't hear how all of those projects linked to each other, or how the data would come together, or how systems might be integrated to support the process. And that doesn't really fit in the remit of product-focused delivery projects or a specific operational need. But it was absolutely recognised as a gap that needed to be solved. There wasn't really an owner of all of this and the customer experience vision, I guess, that tied all of these together. And I find that usually in these situations, it's normally true that the role of systems and data architecture isn't aligned either, because there isn't something that's aligning them to a common purpose. Without solving this, I wasn't convinced that we'd make progress. So I went back to the senior leadership team highlighting these early findings, and I proposed running a discovery phase to go back and look at the problem that we're trying to solve. A discovery phase is a low risk way of moving a project forward, gaining visibility and building a body of evidence for change. But also, as Steve was mentioning, it's ensuring that focus is applied to the areas of most benefit. In this case, I wanted to look across the end-to-end customer journey and uncover the customer experience, but also the colleague experience as well. So how can we make it easier for our colleagues to deliver a great experience to customers? So the nature of a discovery phase is going to vary by project. So being very clear on the objective of discovery is obviously important, as is keeping an open mind and being really objective in moving through it. Building a team of cross-functional stakeholders is important, and for me, this was really key to the success of it. we had to break out of the organizational and product silos. We had to make sure that we were including all of the projects planned, as well as the teams that are responsible for aspects of product delivery to customers. So I think you have to think about who you're going to need support from and make sure that there's good representation in there. I needed to involve teams across the whole journey, but also, given the global nature of the operation, we need to make sure there was enough representation to capture all the geographical and cultural differences that exist as well. So we ran interviews with stakeholders and ran workshops and made a point of consuming all the previous research that had been taken and bringing all of that together. And for me, this next one's really important. I wanted to record customer interviews and stakeholder workshops so that we had a video asset that we could share at points later in the project. Now, this is probably easier now than it's ever been to try and achieve. We're all working on video and remote calls now, so building that was relatively easy. But I started doing this. There was a time it was working with a travel business years ago. We did some usability to validate the scope of a project that was being put forward, and we had a feeling that some of the proposal wasn't quite meeting customer needs. So we ran this usability workshop, but we were struggling to get the attention of some of the senior leadership in the business, and specifically the MD who was sponsoring the project. We got a session in the diary, and a couple of minutes before we were starting, we were informed that we only had 15 minutes because there was something else that had come up, and so we weren't going to get that time. So I juggled the agenda, and I opened with a video showing some of the highlights from the usability that we'd run. And it clearly showed that customers' needs and their pain points and what they were looking for wasn't aligned to what the project was looking to deliver. And we've mocked up some of the proposal. Anyway, long story short, the diary was suddenly cleared, and in fact she stayed for the entire 2-hour session because it just had cut through. We humanized that part of the process. So I think that's a really important thing to think about when you're planning a good discovery. Another part was looking outside of the organization as well, and being able to do some benchmarking activity. So fortunately, timing wise, we were able to take part in the customer centricity study. And there were a few parts to this that I think on reflection were really valuable. One of those was the process of getting stakeholders to answer the questions, to actually consider how we thought about customers, how customer centric we really were, and not just looking at does the customer exist within projects, but what's the organizational approach to customer centricity. Obviously doing benchmarking is really valuable. It helps to see where you are perhaps on a different scale that you're aware of when you're just looking internally. And so that really helped to, I guess, reset expectations. We also gained valuable insights into the traits and behaviours of the top performing companies. So Steve referenced there, what some of the most customer centric businesses were seeing as against those further down. And we're not at the bottom of the scale by any stretch, but it shows that there's still a way to go. And I think that's really important. And I think there'll be some links to take part in this. So from my view, I think this is good insight to get. The other bit is it helped to make the case for some of the softer benefits that sometimes it's harder to quantify and get some evidence behind. But it also made us consider the cultural change that could be required if we were looking for a more holistic approach to customer centricity. So seeing that at an organizational level. So thinking about the outcomes, having run this, what we have now is a vastly different understanding of the problem statement. The scope has changed, and that means that the approach has had to change too. Interestingly, the original proposal is still in the mix, but it's now part of the solution rather than being the solution. And that means that the people's view of what it is that we're trying to achieve has changed as well. We've got much more clarity and validation of the problem statement. The process of running the discovery phase, it should create lots of awareness, but also support for the project. The area's benefits should become clear, and stakeholders should be aligned, not least because they've all played a part in helping to reach the conclusion. And obviously, this is important when you get into investment and prioritization, that you've got that support from other stakeholders across the business. I've also been able to confidently share the discovery work across the organization, and I think that's really important as well. Not everyone's going to be involved in discovery, but everyone should be aware of what went into it, believe in the process, and then be totally aligned in terms of the outcomes that come with it. So we've done that through teams. And again, having recorded the sessions, it's now possible to bring the customer into the room when we're making those pitch for investment or communicating the change. And as an example, I gave an update to the investment committee members, and by bringing in some of those videos and having the voice of the customer and the voice of our colleagues in the room, humanizing the problems firsthand, it allowed those members to much quicker to get close to the problem and move it away from being a spreadsheet exercise into, that's something I can empathize with. So, as Steve said, sometimes discovery can be seen as a slowing down, as as a cost. And after discovery, you want to move quickly to start addressing some of the problems that customers and colleagues face. However, you might find, as I am, that discovery phase highlighted some previously unplanned areas, and in this case, it might be right to run a second discovery to go and validate the outcomes of that. That doesn't mean that everything else has to be put on pause. And it doesn't mean that every discovery phase needs to be of the same size and complexity. So I think being able to run iterative discovery phases as part of an agile delivery is a really good way to go forward. Personally, I see it as a valuable phase of the delivery for projects, but especially in programs of change. And as I say, you might go through several cycles of them. I think usability testing is a great tool for ongoing discovery and sort of process iteration. In a previous role, the company didn't do enough of it, or where it was being used as a validation at the end of the process. When we redesigned the core sales journey with the customers, so starting off with how they were interacting, we made sure that we held on to pieces that were beneficial to them, but also we were able to make change with confidence to understand the pain points that we were overcoming. But there was an additional element to that. The sales journeys were also white labeled for partners, and historically, partners would always bring along their own specific requirements, and that meant quite a separate common journey would need to be built and maintained. The discovery phase had done, and what led us to be making the changes, and how usability, what usability highlighted, and how it played out as we went through the designs that we made and how they met customer needs, that changed their processes too. They were much happier with the initial offering. They believed in the process that we'd gone through, but also there was a common understanding that any changes being requested would need to be tested and go through and make sure that they were still supporting a better delivery. And obviously that was a huge efficiency gain onwards. So that benefit of discovery actually played dividends further down the line as well. So whilst discovery may not be right for every project, and it could be seen as additional time and cost, my experience has always been that it saved time and money by avoiding costly and lengthy projects that would have been focused only on part of the problem. It's a valuable phase of the project to align everyone on the purposes and the goals. So that's some of my experiences. I think we'd like to open up for questions. So I'm going to hand you back to Lauren now.
Great.
Thanks.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Steve. That was great. Really, really good stuff. So we've had a few questions come through as you've been talking, which I'll run through first. But just to remind everybody, please bung any more questions that you've got into the webinar chat or indeed into the Q&A box. So the first question that we've had is, how do you convince your client to do the research? I think this was when you were speaking about the co-op example, Steve. And what did you say to convince the client, and what was the process?
So I think there's a couple of things. I think with the co-op example, it was about, we had to get them bought into UCD as a whole thing, really. And I think one of the things that helped was showing measurable results as a part of going through this process. So similar to what I just showed you, with all these lovely percentage increases and things like that, numbers speak volumes, I suppose. I think what Paul talked about with video, or getting people in front of users is so super powerful. It can be easier said than done. So usually bringing video is the easiest way to do that. And I think with the co-op as well, it was partly about kind of trying to highlight to them that maybe they didn't really understand the problems. And sometimes when we get briefs in, we will just do a sneaky bit of low fidelity research just to kind of get an understanding of user needs. So we've got something to kind of show that might kind of break their expectations a little bit, I think.
Great, thank you. Another question we've had is, what might an example program of discovery look like?
Ooh, that's a big question, isn't it? I'm allowed to throw out and it depends. Gosh, I guess it depends on the problem that the problem space that you're trying to solve. It would definitely include a mix of input, be that quantitative, qualitative, internal interviews, external interviews. I think, and it depends what that discovery is for. So if it's for like a new proposition, let's say you're kind of developing a new product and you don't really know what that product is, you need to think about what are the questions that we need to answer in order to be able to confidently have a proposition that we're confident in, right? So you think about what are those questions that we need to answer for this to be true, and then what are the activities that we need to do to answer those questions. And that would be a mix of technical discovery, user discovery, market discovery. There'd be all sorts of things going on there. So it's hard to kind of pin down an exact one, but I guess hopefully that's kind of a process you can go through to help to figure out what it is you would need.
Great, thank you. A question from Harrison: how do we realistically deliver on learnings from continuous discovery, especially if we've committed to delivering longer term validated projects?
Yeah, that's a tricky one, isn't it? So if I'm understanding that right, that's about committing to still getting user input while you've got to deliver at the same time, right? I mean, yeah, that's a tricky one. I wonder if part of it is about baking research into your delivery process as well, and ensuring that you are testing things and researching as you go, because discovery, as Paul said, doesn't need to be right at the start. It can be kind of all the way through. And as you're doing that user research, you might learn new things that you need to do. But I'm not sure I've answered that particularly well, Paul. I don't know if you had anything.
Well, I'm just thinking about this. One of the challenges, and you highlight it with the research around the model, highlighted the most mature businesses are the ones who are fastest at being able to iterate and deliver change. So they're more flexible and able to pivot, and therefore the decision is less significant. What I found, we get ourselves tied up in prioritization, and I'm thinking back to previous roles here, but we can get ourselves tied up in prioritization because the pipe's only so wide. You've got to be absolutely confident in terms of what you're pushing through it, but also that project's going to be 6 months, 9 months to get out the door, and therefore that the weight of that decision is big. But I think if you're in a position where you're being much more flexible, you can be more playful with it. You can put something out there and start to see whether it's working. If it's not, take it away, and that's maybe cost you 6 weeks, 8 weeks, and that's a totally different stance. So I think it's really interesting when you start to dig into the flexibility that this gives. I don't know if that's a different answer, but it's an answer.
Thank you, Paul. There's a couple of questions directly to you, actually. So Rupert asked, Paul, how much traction have you had from senior leadership from the maturity model in British Council, and how did you win that?
So, so in taking part in the maturity model, we got a few people to answer, and obviously we put one set of answers in there. Actually, I got the director for English and exams to do the completion, so to actually be putting it in there and talking to stakeholders, but it was him answering it, and I thought that was quite important. He's quite invested in this project, or the need for change, and so getting involved in that. But I think then socializing where we stand in that range has been maybe a bit eye-opening for some, validating for others. So there's been a broad mix, but generally I would say that there's been a lot of support, and there wasn't necessarily a lot of support early on, but having gone through this process, and we're not just coming up with a solution, we're coming at it. I'm desperately trying to present this as our customers are experiencing this at the moment. Our colleagues are having to go through this. And in some ways, I feel that the program we're talking about here is the glue that sits between all the other projects that's going on, and it's almost bringing a different perspective into it. So far, the engagement's been pretty good, and I think there's understanding in terms of how that goes through. But I come back to being able to bring the customer into the room and showing people firsthand, and you could see some of the reactions. People going, "Oh, right, okay," and there's that real light bulb moment, and I think it just cuts through so much better than a PowerPoint deck or a spreadsheet is ever able to do.
Super powerful, yeah. I see it all the time.
Another question for you, Paul. Do you have any top tips for navigating complex matrix? Oh gosh, hang on, the question's just disappeared. Top tips for navigating complex matrix organizations and bringing the bigger picture together amongst competing priorities.
Yes, and it's never easy. I think the way I went about it here was to try and make sure that we got some representation. And I think, as I said, that representation came by really considering who the stakeholders were going to be and making sure that everyone was going to feel that their area had at least been considered. And that was tricky because geography comes into that, product lines comes into that, and then you've got the different functions within the organization. So those responsible for keeping the systems up, or data integrity, or actually delivering some of the digital services. We needed to get input from all of those, but if you're not careful, you end up designing by committee, which is also a terrible outcome. And so we divided this up into workshops, into individual stakeholder interviews. So we identified individuals, and very, very early on, that was the first thing that we did, was to go and have stakeholder interviews. And then everything that came out of those, we were able to feed in and kind of sprinkle that into some of the workshops that we were having. And then the other bit was to make sure that we were having regular stand-ups. So we divided discovery into sprints. At the end of each of those sprints, we'd get the steering group together that we'd put together. And again, sounding like a stuck record, we recorded those sessions. So we had Miro boards, we had a Teams meeting, we recorded that, and then we made that video available everywhere. So we were very open, very transparent about how that would work, and really push for cascade. If I'm honest, that's something we probably could have done even more, is pushing the cascade of that as we were going through it. I just think trying to get as many people involved and able to be involved as possible is the bit. But it's the hardest element, I think, in trying to design it in the first place.
Great. Thank you for that. And another question I think builds on what you've just talked about, but we've talked a lot about the importance of getting stakeholders on board with the discovery. But is there a way to show the value of discovery while it's going on and while it's running?
Yes. And I think it's really easy to show the value of discovery while it's going on if you can get people in the room watching the research. I think it's kind of echoing what Paul said, really, is the easiest way. That's obviously easier said than done, getting busy people in the room, and you can quite quickly see with a lot of discoveries where some of the assumptions might be wrong, so you may not need to always wait till the right at the end, right, to start reporting some of this back. So that's kind of how I would do it, is about being open with your discovery and not just inviting people to attend the sessions, but encouraging people to attend the sessions. Quite often, when we're doing projects, we do all our note taking of our sessions in a Miro board. So a lot of the kind of stakeholders and core team can actually take notes with us. They can ask questions. They can post questions that we can then use to investigate. When this is if we're doing sort of depth interviews. If we're doing sort of contextual research, it might not be so viable, but it just means getting all those people on board. There is a risk with that you need to be careful of. So if you show like one video or invite somebody to one session, they might latch on to something that's been said, and that ends up only being said by that person, or that ends up not being a theme. So there is a little bit of caution to use with that, but I think it's about open and collaborative discovery is the way forward with that, I would say.
Brilliant. I have a question from Becky. What are the pros and cons of outsourcing discovery versus bringing it in-house?
Good question. I mean, I'm always the person that gets outsourced to, so
do you want me to answer that one?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah,
I think it has to be a blend. I don't think this is something you can entirely outsource, because if I'd outsourced it, then I think you get the answers coming. I don't think that we wouldn't have got the engagement that we'd had all the way through. I don't think people would feel their voices were heard. We work with CXPartners, it won't be any surprise for you to know. And I think the way we treated that was, CXPartners were an extension of our team. But it meant that you had someone very, very impartial who was able to facilitate the process all the way through. And I think that adds huge value. It really makes sure that it's objective and is focused in on finding the problem, and then solutions to that problem, rather than validating the assumption that we came in with and therefore move through. I think there's a really good balance to doing it that way. But personally, I think it only works if it's an extension of your team rather than outsourcing and handing it over.
Yeah, I think I'd echo that, because the last thing you would want is to have an external agency come in and do your discovery and then leave and take all that lovely insight with them, right? And all you get left with is some sort of report. It needs to be that there are people within the organisation that can take that insight and run with it.
Brilliant. I think, unfortunately, that's all the time we've got for the questions. If you had a burning question that you would like to ask Steve and Paul, please just fire over an email to marketing@cxpartners.co.uk and we'll make sure that gets answered. The screen in front of you is showing our customer centricity model, and you can access our self-assessment survey just on the left there, and then on the right that's our white paper, which is that bringing together of all the study into customer centricity, and it goes into the dimensions. So please take a look at both of those. Our next session is next Wednesday on governance, and we're going to be talking about decentralizing teams and empowering teams in that session. So if it's not already in your diary, do again drop us a note and we can send that over. But a huge thank you to Steve and Paul. That was a brilliant session, and yeah, I'm excited for next week now.
Thank you for all the questions. They were really good. So yeah, it was going to come through, but they were nice.
Thanks everybody.